how that relates to the accountability system. As we think about just where we are from a standpoint of school, it's May 22nd. That means we're winding down. We're just having a little discussion about the calendar and how it looks a little different. So for those of you who hear things, hear complaints about why we're not getting Good Friday off, or why the seniors are graduating Sunday, we still have to come back and thank our legislature for the gifts they give us. And so if you think it'd be a great idea for you guys to do that, I'm sure they don't do that because they want us to start later in August because the tourism industry said so. The tourism industry feeds their pockets with money. I'm sure politically that's not what it is. I'm not sure what it is, and I know it's not that. So we'll talk about it. But it's just a challenge that presents to us because the fourth Monday, we know it could be the 22nd, it could be the 28th, and that makes a lot of difference. If you're the 26th, 7th, or 8th, then it's kind of hard to take those breaks in there the way our community, our kids, our staff like to do, and still finish without going into June. It just creates a difficult schedule. So when people say, oh my gosh, why are they doing that? Please say Dr. Brown did not have this great idea that it'd be good to do. That is not it. We work within the parameters we have, we deal with those things. I only say that is because those same examples exist as tied to assessment accountability. They give us a lot of guidelines, structures, and came out with things that we've just about been able to debate out, but they say, oh yeah, we've got to take these tests here, and oh, by the way, they have to count 50% of the grade. The fact that we're not going to get you results to June, that shouldn't present a problem to you. We go, wait a minute, if we're not going to put the results to June, how are we going to count it 50% grade of a kid? That it's just all those things that if they would come and say, hey, we're thinking about this, can you tell us how that would impact our system? A lot of that's been going on in assessment accountability. I will say that we're in the final stages, but what David Holland will share with you this morning is just where we are with it, where we are with in the second year of assessments of STAR. And in fact, today is the deadline. May 22nd today, we're supposed to get a significant amount of results from our results from 3 through 8. We've got the first round of results in some of the 5th and 8th for reading and math. We get science and some other areas, and then we get the results for the 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 7th. So get a lot of good data today. We'll share a little bit of some of our results we got in 5th and 8th grade, many positive results there. So our focus remains unchanged. I don't mind saying publicly to anyone that sure, I'm disappointed anytime you get bond package together and it doesn't pass. You have to be disappointed because that gives you an opportunity to move forward, some things there. I think our committee did a great job of looking at our needs, and our needs are expensive. So that's disappointing, but I will commit to you our focus is unchanged. The magnitude of the impact we can have may have changed some, but we're still committed to making progress. We are. We look at different programs we have, from all the way up to our advanced academics, down to our most needy kids and special programs. So we're putting things in place. We've got the cabinet and the leadership and making adjustments we need to do the very best we can with what we have. So we're committed to that. So at this time, I'll turn it over to David Holland, and he'll give you some good information about our assessment accountability, and we'll have a time at the end to answer any questions you have. So jot those down, and we'll certainly try to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Good morning, everyone. I know that last week, John and Solly and some of our staff were here and talked to you about curriculum and instruction. The assessment piece, as it relates to curriculum and instruction, is a really important one. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on the state assessment system and the state accountability system, which is the stuff that's important because that's what we read about in the newspaper. But recognize that in the classroom, there are other assessments that are constantly going on a daily and weekly and monthly basis in the classroom that sort of produce results on these state assessments, but we believe that those are much more important because those types of assessments are the ones that teachers can use to make immediate decisions about instruction in the classroom, which is really important. So this is sort of the forward-facing view of assessment in terms of what the state says that we need to do. And so what I'd like to do is to just kind of cover up a couple pieces, and hopefully by the time we're finished, that first of all, you'll be able to recognize some of the key components to our state assessment system as it exists today. Currently, as you know, our legislature is making decisions to change our state assessment and accountability system. So what's true today may not be true this time next week, but I'm going to let you know what it looks like right now. Help you also to appreciate how the new STAR assessment system sort of raises the bar in terms of expectations for student learning, and also to help you to understand a little bit about our new accountability system, which is brand new this year. We've never really seen the results of it yet. We know what it looks like, but we haven't really seen any results, so we don't know exactly what the outcomes of the system are. But I want to try to help you to understand sort of how districts and how campuses are held accountable in the state accountability system and how they've structured that in a brand new way. So just a couple of things to think about is, first of all, there's a lot of information about testing and accountability that's out there, so I don't want you to feel too much like you're drinking from the fire hose today, but just recognize that I live and drink and breathe this kind of on a daily basis, so please excuse me if it seems a little bit too much. Just wave your hand if it seems like too much. Also, this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the stuff that's out there. So I just want to give you the broad brush overview to this. That's bad. And then at the in our business, since there's so many changes going on, sometimes we feel like this guy. You might remember the old Ed Sullivan show when I was having these guys on there doing this. When you sort of seem to have all the plates spinning just right, then the state comes along and they make some changes on you, and so we're constantly sort of chasing around and doing these things. And at this time, it's especially poignant in the fact that we're really on the brink of some major changes in terms of our assessment and accountability systems. So as I go through this, maybe just as you sort of think about some of these ideas that I bring up, there should be a handout that has some different categories there on it that I'm going to ask later on that maybe you share with the group of people around you. What are some observations maybe that you make in terms of the information that you're hearing? What are some concerns or questions that you might have? As Dr. Brown said, we'll have some time at the end for questions, and I hope to be able to answer all those for you as best I know. And what are kind of the implications of this? What does this mean to you personally? What does it mean to us as a district, as a community, those types of things. So just as we go through, if you could just sort of frame your thoughts and questions around that, I think that will be helpful to drive the discussion at the end. Now, our state assessment system as it exists today in 2013 really has three major components. Two of them I'm sure you've heard a lot about. One of them, I guess, unless you're involved with education closely, you probably have not heard of that. And that's the first one up there. The TELPAS assessment is the Texas English Language Proficiency Assessment System. So this is an assessment that we do of our students who are English language learners. So students who do not have English as their home language, they are required to be assessed using the TELPAS system. Now TELPAS is very different from our other state assessment system because you know that TAX and STAR, students come in, they sit down, you give them a piece of paper, and they take a paper and run some tests. Well, TELPAS actually measures 4 different categories of English language learning. One is listening, one is speaking, writing, and reading. Now the reading component is evaluated online. So if we have a student that moves to our country, to Burkeville ISD in, let's say February, knows no English, we set that student down in March on a computer and ask that student to take a test in English reading. Okay, so by state law, we're required to do that. All right, so reading is more of a traditional assessment. However, those other 3 things, listening, speaking, and writing, the teachers are required to evaluate the students in their classroom. So if I'm a math teacher or an English teacher and I have an English language learner in my classroom, I have to rate that student in listening, speaking, and writing. Now the writing component means that I have to have at least 4 samples of that student's writing in order to evaluate their English language acquisition. In other words, I have to rate how well those kids are learning English. Now in order to do that and to calibrate my rating of those students, I have to take some training and then actually be tested. So all of the teachers in our district, and we have over 400 teachers that are involved in this TELPAS program, they have to do training, they have to be calibrated every year, they have to take a test to make sure that they're ready to assess these students. And all of that takes place basically outside of the regular duties in the classroom. Now, at some of our campuses, we have very few English language learners. So we might have 10 or 15 total on an elementary campus. You go to West Burkeville, though, and they have 387 English language learners. So they actually test more students using the TELPOS system than they do in STAR. And again, this is teachers doing the work and looking and observing their students and using a rubric to evaluate them. So this is a big and important assessment, and I believe we absolutely should do it. However, the state doesn't really provide us any compensation for that extra time that it takes for teachers to put into it. So teachers on campuses that have a large proportion of their population who are English language learners are especially impacted by the TELPOS system. And I think it's ironic that that one is really important and highly impactful on teachers' time, yet many people don't even know that it even exists. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that you understood that there's more than just the tax and STAR piece. Now, our grandfather test is the tax test. And this year, only our 11th graders are that are finished taking the tax test. That's under the old system, started in 2003. We do have the 11th graders this year and any 12th graders who may not have passed one or more portions of that test. So pretty much that test is going to be finished after this year with a few kids having to take retests after this. Of course, STAR is the new baby that we started with last year. And so this year we tested grades 3 through 10 on the STAR assessment. And this one is a much different look at ways to assess students. And it's much more vertically aligned, which is, I believe, a great approach to assessment. Because with tax, what we test in 3rd grade really wasn't very well aligned with what we taught and tested in 4th grade. However, with STAR, the tests are vertically aligned, so that now we know if a student performed at a certain level on the 3rd grade test, that tells us something about how well he or she is prepared for 4th grade work, which is a great boon. Okay, the old assessment tax, it really didn't tell us that. However, the new one is vertically aligned in a way that gives us some really good information about the learning of our students. Now, STAR comes in several different flavors depending on the types of students that are taking the assessment. The general STAR assessment is available for any student. However, we do have a STAR L test, and L stands for linguistic accommodations. So students that are recent immigrants to the country, English language learners who need some help with understanding English, there's a version of the test for them. There's also an M or modified version of the test for our students that are special ed students who are receiving instruction in a modified curriculum. So they're still learning the grade level standards, but they're learning at a slightly different level. So the assessment still tests those grade level standards, but it's written in a way that's more accessible to the students. Like, for example, instead of 4 answer choices, they have 3 answer choices. The font is a little bit bigger on the page. They give them some extra information that other students may not have on the STAR. They're also allowed certain accommodations because of their special education status in order to help kids to access the test and the curriculum through the STAR and test. And then finally, our most severely and profoundly disadvantaged students take the STAR All. These are students that can't write, hold a pencil, and so these students have a special assessment that teachers give them called the alternate assessment, and so they evaluate their development and their basic skills in the areas of math, science, social studies, and writing. So let's take a look at sort of how we went from tax to STAR, and I don't really know where you have students in the district and where they are, but I'm assuming that several of them had to take the tax test. So grades 3 through 11, here's what we tested: reading and math at every grade level. And then 4th grade and 7th grade we tested writing, and then it's 8th grade social studies, and then 5th and 8th grade we tested science. Well, under the STAR system, we're basically doing exactly the same thing. We're testing those exact same subjects and those same grade levels in grades 3 through 8. So that part of it really didn't change that much. However, where the most significant change took place as we moved from tax to STAR was at the high school level. And if you have a high schooler that's in 9th or 10th grade this year, you probably have heard quite a bit about end of course exams. So rather than having a 9th, 10th, and 11th grade test, what they did instead is they now have these end of course exams. Because under the tax system, for example, if you took a math test as an 11th grader, that test tested geometry and algebra and some of the 8th grade math. If you took a science test at the 11th grade, that test tested some chemistry, some physics, some biology, and some stuff from 8th grade. So even though you were sitting in, let's say, a physics class at the time under tax, you were tested over stuff that you weren't even learning that year. You might not have learned it up to 3 years prior to when you actually took the test. So as they developed the new system, they thought, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So that's why they moved to the end of course exams. So as it stands right now today, a high schooler, in order to graduate from high school, just the average kid taking the basic program, not the basic program, but the recommended high school program, they would need to take 6 English tests, okay, English 1, 2, and 3, a reading test and a writing test in each one, 3 math tests, 3 science tests, and 3 social studies tests, and basically get a passing grade in all of those tests in order to be able to graduate from high school. Whereas under tax, they had to basically pass 4 tests. Okay, under STAR, though, the way it stands today, they would need to pass 15 different tests in order to be able to graduate. So it sounds great because now if I'm sitting in a geometry class, I'm taking a test over the geometry that I just learned. So that makes a lot of sense. However, the overwhelming nature of 15 tests, in order to passing 15 tests to be able to graduate is just unmanageable. And so now the legislature has finally figured out, yes, the parents have cried out loud and long about this, and so now they're working to make those changes and to actually take away some of those requirements for graduation. But again, this is where we stand today. So here's what STAR looks like. And so right now, the 2 big bills that are sort of functioning down there in Austin, and they've got another week, I guess, to sort of hammer all that out. We have House Bill 5 and House Bill 2836. Those are the 2 really that are in place down there, and I made a slight change to this slide. I have a little problem, and that is that I'm never finished. So I sent this to Mark, and he was nice enough to print this off, but of course I was working on this last night. But nonetheless, under the new system, under House Bill 2836, they have proposed a couple of things. One is taking away writing in 4th and 7th grade. Another one is taking away the social studies test, so they discussed that as part of that bill. We don't know exactly where that's going to fall, whether it's just going to die in the Senate's committee, but those are some proposals that they've made to changes to the STAR in grades 3 through 8. Now, at the high school level, House Bill 5 has very extensively addressed not only the assessment system, but also the requirements for graduation. I'm not going to go into that whole big ball of wax, but just know they're considering changing what's required of students in order to graduate from high school. And as part of that, they're talking about removing some of these end-of-course exams. And depending on whether you're looking at the Senate version or the House version of the bill, House Bill 5, they're talking about removing possibly the geometry test, the algebra 2 test, 2 of the social studies tests, 2 of the science tests. So under each version of those, basically 5 tests that are left over for students to need to take in order to graduate from high school. So this, again, is in a high state of flux right now, and we're not sure what's going to come out of that. And this is especially interesting because just last week and the week before, we were testing students on these end-of-course exams. And if they didn't pass the test, then they need to come in July in order to retest, and we need to remediate those students to help them to pass. Well, here they are sitting, waiting for the results to come back at the beginning of June, and we have all these question marks here. So if I was a 10th grader and I was sitting on the geometry test, there's a question mark there, that geometry test may completely go away. So I may have taken that test and it may not count for anything in the future. Now that's good if I didn't do so well, but on the other hand, I put effort into it. So a lot of things are up in the air in terms of our assessment system, and so that's just kind of the current state until we get a little bit more out of the legislature. Okay, our STAR system really has raised the bar in 2 different ways. One is that it's provided us with much more rigor in the questions that students are being asked. So in your packet, you have a set of items that I pulled together from prior tests. And so what we're going to do is I would like you to take a look at these questions, and we're going to see if you're smarter than a 5th grader. And but I'm not going to have you actually answer the questions, so I don't want you to get bogged down in the math part of this. But rather, I want you to discuss at your tables, number 1, and most importantly, what grade level do you feel these particular items would be best addressed? In other words, if it looks like a 5th grade item, that's what you'd say. So there's, I think, 6 or 7 of these. There's 6 different questions there. So as a group or as pairs there, you could just go through these questions and discuss them and come to some sort of agreement as to what grade level you think those items are appropriate for. Yeah. If you think it's second grade, I didn't say it necessarily was third grade.
Sixth grade. Sixth grade.
We can go as high as you want.
That's where we were headed.
Tabs, teams, tabs, teams, toss. Hey, raise your hand if you need more time. Okay, let's go back through these. I think these are very interesting because, and unfortunately, the answers were given in the handout there, but nonetheless, this one I think is great because how much math do you really need to know in order to answer this question?
None.
Absolutely zero, or you have to know greater than or less than. Right? Okay, so basically you have to do no calculations. All you have to do is say which one of those has the least number of barrels in the picture in order to answer this question. Okay? What grade level does this seem like? Is this appropriate for? Third, second, first. I mean, it's pretty low. Now, back in 1982, this is what we expected our 10th graders to know. Okay, way back on the TABS test, which was the first state assessment that we had in Texas. Okay, that's very low level question. Okay, so now TABS stands for the Texas Assessment of Basic Skills. Well, yes, this is a pretty basic skill. Can you count barrels? Okay, that's basically what it's asking you to do. Okay, this one requires a little bit of math at least. Okay, so we've got this graph, and it says in 1990 the tuition was $300 per student. According to the graph, how much money was collected. So what would you have to do in terms of thinking about coming up with the answer in order to be able to answer this question? What are the skills you would have to have? You'd have to be able to divide. Before you got to dividing, what would you have to do? You'd have to read the graph, right? So you'd have to say, okay, 1990, how many students were there based on the graph? And then what would you need to do? Then you would multiply, okay, $300 times the 30 kids. So it's basically a two-step problem, right? Well, that's what we were asking our 10th graders to do in 1986. Okay, so we raised up the standard a little bit. Teams was, the M stands for minimal skills. So instead of basic, now we're up to the minimal skills in the later 80s. Okay?
What grade level would you put that at?
What grade level would I put that at now? Probably 4th grade, maybe. 3rd or 4th, somewhere around in there. Okay. So this one, now, they're looking at this pie chart, and it asks about what percent of the total solid waste is paper. Well, they can look in the chart and see, well, there was 72 million tons of paper, right? So they have to read the chart. That's not too difficult. And then they also provided them with some other information that makes this question easier. Do you see that? They tell them what the total weight was. If they would take that off, wouldn't this question be harder? Because the student would have to figure out the total weight and then divide to get at the percentage. But under the TOS test, we gave the students the information. Basically, they had to use very minimal kind of skills in order to get at the answer. Okay? What's that?
What grade now?
What grade? I don't know. What do you think? 5th grade?
5th grade.
Probably 5th grade, somewhere around in there. Depends on when pie charts are introduced. Okay? Because basically, it's just figuring out percent. 5th or 6th grade. All right. So this one. We've got votes per candidate for some sort of election on campus. And now the question, instead of having the students interpret the circle graph, what are they asking them about? It says, when making a circle graph. So now, instead of reading the graph that's already made for them, they're asking them questions, okay, given the data, how do you build the graph? Okay? Which is a higher level skill, right? Okay, so now they give them some other information there that you'll notice that the students in the chart are not ranked in the order of how they finished up on the election, right? So this is a multiple step question. First, they got to figure out who finished in 3rd place, because it's not the 3rd person down. Okay, so they have to figure that out. Then they have to figure out the total number of votes. Then they need to figure out a percentage. Then you need to multiply that percentage times 360 degrees in a circle. So it's about a 4-step question. Okay? So now we were asking our kids on tax in 11th grade, which is the exit level test that our kids took a couple of weeks ago in Burtonville ISD to graduate from high school. Our 11th graders were taking questions like this. All right? So as we went through the years, you can see that our system got more rigorous in terms of the kind of questions and what we were expecting students to do at the high school level. All right, well, what did you think about this one? What grade level did you come up for this cookie question? 3rd or 4th grade? Okay, this indeed was a 3rd grade question from the released items that they gave us. They gave us about 10 or 15 released items last year in August that give us an idea of what STAR looked like. Now, think about what a student has to do to be able to answer this question. you got a third grader or a second grader at home, think about their ability to do this. Okay, so we have a chart at the top that says here's how many cookies were sold in each week. And then they give them the pictograph that shows at the bottom what those data look like when they're graphed. Then the question asks them to come up with an answer that they have to do a number of things. They have to look at the data, compare that to the chart at the bottom, and then they actually have to divide to come up with the answer. Now, if they pick the first one and say 25 divided by 2.5, most third graders don't know how to do that sort of math. So they would have to rely on 40 divided by 4 or 30 divided by 3 in order to get at the correct answer. Now think about what we were asking 10th graders to do back in the 80s as compared to what we are expecting our third graders to do today. And think about also the challenges of the classroom teacher to try to teach students to think in a way that now is analyzing multiple sources of data and then applying their analysis to some mathematical calculation. That's very high-level stuff. Is it appropriate for third grade? I think so. But now instead of expecting third graders just to be able to crunch numbers, we're asking them to think in order to solve questions. And so the results that we're expecting today for our third graders in math are based on questions like this. Okay? And hopefully you understand that this incredibly raises the bar in terms of the cognitive expectations of students. What we're expecting kids to know and do and be able to solve now is very, very different than what we've ever asked kids to do under any system in the past. Now, I think this is a great thing, but also, remember I started out by saying these tests are the things that are in the newspaper and are used to evaluate our districts and our campuses. Now, do you think that the average person on the street, number one, would be able to answer this question? Number two, understand that this is the level of rigor that we're asking of our third graders. I don't think the average person really understands that. And so I hope that you, and in your role in this group here, can help to communicate the message that we're asking a high level of rigor of our students and we've never asked it before. And we have a big system, okay? We have this big ship. And to turn that ship to start attending to things that are this higher level of rigor is very difficult. And so that's the challenges that we have as the district. We've got this past system that under TOPS worked pretty well, under TAX maybe not so well. Now we got even more challenges, so how are we going to respond as a district? And it's very urgent because it's nigh upon us. Okay? It's right here today, right now. Okay, so this one, I don't know, maybe you put doctoral program in math or something for this question, but I think this is very, very telling as well. This question actually is what we're asking our students on the end of course exam for Algebra 2 to do now. Okay, so our high school students under the current plan that's in place, they basically would have to pass a test with questions like this in order to graduate from high school. All right, so here, this one's talking about the quadratic function. It shows a graph. It says the graph's going to be translated 5 units to the right and 4 units down. What's the equation that represents that graph if we move it? All right, this is some pretty high level and esoteric kind of mathematical stuff that we're expecting every kid who graduates from high school to be able to do. All right, so they would need to think in their minds, okay, if I move this graph over here, what's the equation going to look like? All right, so that's the level of rigor we have. Now go back to the barrels. That's what we were asking in 1982. Here's what we're asking of our high school graduates now. Okay, it's really incredible how much the system has changed. Okay, so if you're thinking about our state assessment system in terms of when you were in school, if you were subjected to state assessment in Texas or another state, okay, we've really raised the bar considerably since the program was started. Okay, now here's the other challenge that our classroom teachers and our students have, is that behind every one of the questions on these STAR tests, there is a learning standard. And I know Don talked a little bit about those standards and how we're approaching the use of those standards in instruction in the classroom. So I want to break this one down just a little bit for you to help you to understand what those challenges really are. So here's what the standard says. So this is what kids are supposed to be able to know and do in order to be successful in Algebra 2 and on this test. Students expected to use the parent function to investigate, describe, and predict the effects of changes in A, H, and K on the graphs of y equals a times quantity x minus h squared plus k form of a function in applied and purely mathematical situations. Easy for you to say. Okay? Now, reading it and understanding it is hard enough, but learning it is way hard. Okay? So, let's break that down. Here's what teachers have to do. So we're encouraging our teachers, and our teachers are required to work in professional learning communities. So if I was at Berkeley High School and I was an Algebra 2 teacher, I would be meeting on a weekly basis with the other Algebra 2 teachers, and we would be talking about this and saying, okay, how are we going to teach this so that kids really know this standard? We're going to spend the next week focusing in our Algebra 2 class on this standard and ensuring that every kid knows how to do that in that yellow box and so. So how do they approach that? I don't know. Well, what they do is they look at it from 3 different perspectives. One is they look at the content, okay, the stuff that kids have to know about. So I've underlined in blue there what the content of this standard is. The parent function, so obviously a kid to be able to do this has to know what the heck a parent function is, okay? And then they have to know about what happens when there's changes in A, H, and K. Again, they have to know what those 3 things are. And on the graphs that are produced. So that's the parent function graph, that y equals stuff that's there. So that's the content. Then the teachers have to look at the context. In other words, what is the situation in which students have to demonstrate their knowledge of that content? And in this particular question, it's in a purely mathematical situation. It's a graph, okay? Mathematical type of graph. And then the third piece is the cognition. In other words, what kind of thinking do students have to do in order to be able to answer this question? In this case, they have to predict, right? Because they're saying, if the graph moves over here, what's the new formula? So they have to predict. So as a teacher, I need to think about those 3 things, the content, the context, and the cognition, in order to be able to design instruction so that students can be successful on items like this on the test. Now here's the other complicated piece to this, is that this is just one way to look at that one standard, right? Because there's variables in there, okay? This is the content, but notice that the context, there's 2 possibilities for that. It could either be applied, like if you're talking about building a parabolic mirror for a telescope, okay? If I change this, what effect would that have on the mirror? That's an applied sort of situation. And the cognition, there's 3 different ways that students are expected to interact with the content intellectually. They could investigate, describe, and predict. So when we take all those different possible ways of looking at this, we can talk about changes in A or H or K, and then we can investigate applied situations, we can investigate mathematical situations, so we can do all those. All the different possible combinations means that the state could test this possibly 18 different ways. Okay? So even though it's one standard, it could be assessed so many different ways. And we have seen 10 Algebra 2 questions that the state's not using on the test. That's all we've seen so far. So in a way, we're kind of shooting in the dark. We do have the standard, and we can pick it apart and analyze it and use that to drive our instruction. But what we don't know is how the state is actually assessing it. Okay, we have very, very few examples. All right, so that's kind of where we are in terms of the state assessment and how we're approaching it as a district to appreciate that. So over time, here's how our state assessment system has changed. We had the TAS, then in the 80s we went to the teams, and then in the 90s TOS, and then in 2003 we started TAX, and then last year in 2012 we had our first year of the STAR assessment. So hopefully, based on this activity that we've done together, you can see that the state certainly has raised the level of rigor in their expectations for what students need to know and do when they graduate from high school. Now, as I mentioned before, the STAR tests are aligned in such a way so that student performance on one test tells you how well prepared they are for the next level. And in fact, when we get the results back, kids are cubbyholed really into 3 different areas. They're level 1, which is basically failing, level 2 is passing, level 3 is the advanced performance. Now, the state has defined each one of these in a way to tell us about the student's level of preparedness for the next grade. The student scores the highest level of performance, advanced, which on most tests is about 82 to 85% of the items correct. They are said to be well prepared for the next grade level of course. So if a kid scores advanced in 3rd grade math, then they're well prepared for 4th grade math. Okay, that makes sense. However, if they're just above the passing bar, but not to the advanced level, they are said to be sufficiently prepared for the next grade level. Okay? And I've heard somebody talk about sufficient, and the word, inside there is the word suffice. I think if you went home and said to your loved ones, I think you're so sufficient. Okay? It just kind of is not quite there, right? Well, suffice is good enough. So they're sort of good enough to get by, but they're not really well prepared for the next grade level. So if students score level 2, we're happy because they passed the test. However, they are not completely well prepared for the next grade level. So they may have some holes in their learning that we need to fill in before they can be totally successful at the next level. So part of the work that we also need to do is not only work on what they're learning in this grade level, but assess those students and sort of fill in the gaps that they may have in their learning. So even though they passed the test, we need to be well aware that they're not completely prepared for the next grade level. Okay, and then finally, if they're under level 2, then they're unsatisfactory and inadequately prepared for the next grade level of the course. So those are the 3 ways that the results come back, and so students are put into those 3 categories based on their performance. Now, since the test is more difficult, and the state realizes that, they are ramping up the standards for level 2. In other words, the passing standards are going to start off low, then they're going to go up, then they're going to go up to their final state. And so we need to be really careful, especially these first few years of STAR. We can't be lulled into complacency and thinking that, wow, our kids are doing great if 95% of them are passing, because the bar is set especially low in the first year. So in 2012 and 2013, that's where the bar is set. We're calling that phase 1. So that's basically the passing standard there. Okay, and then in 2014 and 15, so next year and the following year, they're going to raise the bar for passing. Okay, so that's a little bit confusing because if you say, well, 90% of our kids passed in 2013, but only 85% passed in 2014, they've raised the bar. Okay, so it's confusing to the average Joe on the street because they don't recognize, like, wow, that school did worse in 14 than they did in 13. Why is that? Well, you have to sort of explain, well, the state raised the passing standard, and so it makes it more difficult to look at performance over time in a consistent way. So 14, 15, the bar is going to be raised. Then in 2016, they're going to be at what's called the final standard for level 2, and that's going to extend on past. Now, they did have a ramp up with TAPS for 3 years, but it's much more extensive here to give districts an opportunity to catch up with the increased rigor of the test. Now, there's also this advanced performance, and that's in place now, and that's going to stay steady over time, so that's not really going to change. Now, those are kind of nebulous, and it's hard to really know what that means. So if we put on top of that some actual performance levels on the grade 3 math test, I think it'll help you to understand where the state's setting this bar. So here's where it's set based on last year's performance, that the 2012 and 13 standard is set at about 57% of the items correct. So if a student got 58%, 57% correct, then they would have passed this year or last year. However, in 2014, that's going up to 70%. Now, you know in our grading system across the state of Texas, 70% is considered to be passing. Okay? Well, on this test, they have to get 70% of the items correct. Now, remember the cookie question? Well, those are the kind of questions the kids are going to have on the test, and they have to get 70% of them correct next year. However, in 2016, they're going to have to get 80% of the items correct in order to be able to pass the test. Okay? So, how do we have to respond as a district to this increased rigor? Okay? This is a big, big challenge. Notice that passing in 2016 is only 9 percentage points short of the highest level of performance. Okay? So they are definitely changing. Now, as comparison, here's what it looked like in tax. So in tax, in 2003, the first year we had tax, they only needed 53% of the items correct. In 2004, they bumped it up a little bit to 60, and in 2005, they bumped it up to 65%, which is where it was in 2011, the last year that third graders took the math test. So in 2011, our third grade performance was based on getting over a bar that was at 65% of the items. Okay? Remember, the questions were easier also. Okay? So here's the thing, is that STAR really gives us a double whammy. Number one, we already saw how the questions are more difficult under STAR. Number two, the passing standards are a lot higher. Okay? So this is an extreme challenge to our system because our system, quite frankly, was based on an old assessment system and expectations under an old system. Okay? So we are very urgent and intentional in our approach to changing what we're doing in the classroom in order to meet the challenges of this new assessment. Okay, so again, I want to kind of reiterate this idea that the assessment system is now vertically aligned, that how students do in third grade tells us something about how they'll perform in fourth grade. Here's what STAR looks like in grades 3 through 8. And for the first time, they've articulated what happens in English language arts and reading in grades 3 through 8 with the high school program. So what now STAR does is that at English 3 in high school, it tells us how well kids are prepared for post-secondary work, be that in a career or be that in college or university. Their scores on the English 3 test by law are supposed to indicate how well those kids are prepared for post-secondary work. All right, so we now have this vertically aligned system. The pieces of our K through 12 system that are missing are those. Okay? And that is where all of this gets started. So a lot of our focus in our district is starting at the primary grades. Because if kids aren't ready in kindergarten for first grade, they're going to be a little bit of time behind when they get ready for second grade. By the time they hit STAR in third grade, it's going to be hard to get them caught up. So we are focusing K through 12. Remember all the plates? So we're trying to, that proverbial thing, rebuild the airplane while it's in flight. K through 12. That's what we're trying to do right now. And that's the only way we're going to be successful. Okay, now I want to lay on top of that these standards that are ramping up. So in 2016, remember the bar is going to be at the highest point. So as a ninth grader in 2016 who's taking the English 1 test that's going to be required for graduation, where is that kid sitting today? Okay, so that kid is sitting in 6th grade. So the 6th grade English teacher has to be thinking not about just passing the 6th grade reading test, but she has to be thinking about how am I going to ensure that this 6th grader, by the time he or she gets to the 9th grade, is well prepared for that test in English 1. Because frankly, our K-12 system is about producing graduates. Okay, we sometimes lose track of that, but those kids walking across the stage this weekend, those kids are the ones that we're doing all this work for starting with K. And so we have to be really cognizant of the fact that we have a vertically aligned system, making sure and ensuring that our kids are well prepared for the next level. So as a 6th grade teacher, I have to think about how are we going to make sure that our 6th graders are well prepared for success at 7th grade, which will prepare them for 8th grade, etc., and most especially high school. In 5th grade and 8th grade, you may know that students have to pass the reading and math test in order to be promoted to the next grade level. That's the Student Success Initiative, or SSI. Well, 5th graders in 2016 are going to have to get over that highest bar in reading and mathematics. So where are they today? They're sitting in 2nd grade. Do we have a state assessment for 2nd grade? STAR starts in 3rd grade. So how do we know if our 2nd graders are ready? One of the things we've been working on in our district is to give those teachers assessments to tell them whether their students are well prepared in reading and literacy and in mathematics for success at the next grade level. So we've been working very diligently to put tools in the hands of primary teachers, just like we have the state assessment in the other grades. They need assessments as well that are valid and reliable measures of student literacy and student mathematics. And so that's another area that we're working. Those 3rd graders that are going to be tested in STAR in 2016, they're sitting in kindergarten. So we need to think about vertically on the system and longitudinally over time how we're preparing students and getting a greater level of urgency to make sure that kids are well prepared for success at the next level. Okay, so historically, here's how our systems, our Birdville system and the state system performed as we went from TOS to TAX to STAR. Okay, this is sort of a drastic look at this. Under TOS, you see on the left-hand side there, the Birdville dots are the circular aqua-colored ones, and the state is in red triangles. You'll notice under TOS between 94 and 2002 that Birdville was well ahead of the state in terms of our performance from grades 3 through 10, and we continued to improve every year. So under that old system, which had lower level standards, remember, we saw some of those items from the TOS test, we did fairly well as a district, and we outperformed the state consistently. Under TAX, under no surprise, under a more rigorous test with more difficult questions, performance dropped off. But I think the key historical piece here is that as a district, we really didn't recover very well relative to the state. Whereas under the easier test, we were well ahead of the state over time. However, under TAX, we were at the state level, and in the last 2 years, grades 3 through 11, our math performance was below, slightly below the performance of the state. And if we go to the last little piece here to STAR, we are, based on last spring's performance in grades 3 through 9, 3 through Algebra 1, under that highest bar that's going to be in place in 2018, our performance was right at the state. Okay? So this tells me that the last time we were challenged with a more rigorous test, our district did not respond very well. This also tells me that our district has to do something profoundly different in order to get better results. Okay? So this makes things obviously clear that we have to change what we're doing in the classroom and be much more intentional and deliberate about what we're providing for students. Okay, now the good thing is that we do have some preliminary results, as Dr. Brown said. This is based on the 5th and 8th grade reading and math scores. They were tested early in April because those are the 2 grades that have to pass reading and math in order to go on to the next grade. So they actually had a second opportunity to test last week. And so here's our performance relative to the state. So you can see in reading on the left, again, Berkeley's the aqua colored and the state's red. We were ahead of the state on grade 5 reading by 3 points and 2 points ahead in grade 8 reading. But in mathematics, which is the one that I just showed you, over time, you'll notice that we're well ahead of the state in both 5th and the 8th grade in mathematics. And we have been working very diligently to improve mathematics instruction and learning. And so we think this is a very positive sign, and we hope the results, when they end up in my office later this afternoon, that we'll see similar results across the other grade levels. So I think this is a very positive indicator of the work that we've done and the positive impact of that. All right, so that's basically the assessment system. Now, the assessment system drives a lot of our accountability system, and they're making a number of changes to that, including adding more financial information to the accountability system. But I want to talk to you briefly about sort of what that looks like. And so we have the old system that was in place from 2004 through 2011. Last year we didn't have state accountability. We do have a new system that was recently developed that looks very different. So I want to go over some of the differences between them. First, by looking back at our previous system. It looks something like this. And this would be like, for example, North Richland Middle School. They were evaluated in 5 different subject areas across the top: reading, math, writing, science, and social studies. And they were evaluated for 5 subgroups, 5 different groups of students: the all-student group, African American, Hispanic, white, and economically disadvantaged. Now, just so you know, under this system, if there were fewer than 30 students in a group on a campus that was tested, that group wouldn't count in the accountability system. So really, this campus represents sort of the worst case scenario. Now, in green there, I've represented the scores as the percentage of students passing the tax test, because that's what we use for this. These are just made-up numbers, but those would be at the highest level of performance or exemplary. Then the blue ones represent recognized performance. There's none there that are academically acceptable, but there's one group down there, that's 68 in pink, that represents academically unacceptable. So under this old system, how it worked was the performance of a campus or a district was based on the lowest performing group. Okay? So that group of science students who are economically disadvantaged could be 30 kids. So of the 875 kids that Ernie Galvini's has at North Richland Middle School, his performance could have been based on the performance of 30 kids on one test. So as they designed the new system, it was pretty clear that we didn't want this. Okay? Because this seemed patently unfair to rate a campus based on the performance of a group that could be as low as 30 students. So you got to be careful what you wish for, though, because sometimes you can go from the pot into the fire, because this system had some advantages in that I can explain this in about 2 minutes and people can understand it. Our new system, though, is going to be incomprehensible to most people. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around it, exactly how they're going to do it. And then I have the challenge of trying to figure out how they're going to make these calculations. So our new system looks something like this. So this is an index-based system. And so there's going to be 4 indices in this system. The first one is about student achievement, and this is going to look most like our old system. The second one has to do with student progress. So they're going to look at student progress from one year to the next and evaluate campuses and districts based on student growth from one year to the next. The The third one is about closing performance gaps, and typically we look at that based on performance of low-performing groups versus highest-performing groups. They're going to do something a little bit different with that, but they're going to look at our lower-performing groups from one year to the next. And finally, Index 4 has to do with post-secondary readiness. Are our students in high school well prepared for life after high school, and how are we preparing students for the next grade? So those are the 4 indices. Now, each one of these will receive a score. So as a campus, they'll receive a score in each one of these 4 indices. District, same way. And so it'll be from 0 to 100 because it's based on a percentage. Okay, so they'll get a score in each one of these indices, and then that will be used to determine what the campus or the district's rating is going to be for that particular year. Okay? Now, I don't want to go into all the sort of details of all of these because, again, this is sort of in a state of flux, but I think it's important for you to sort of understand how the system differs from what we were at before. First of all, no single student group is going to stand alone. Remember, under that death by single cell, where that one group of 30 kids could determine your rating? Well, under this new system, that won't happen. So that's a good thing. Okay, so they've taken that away. However, now all 7 race ethnicity subgroups are going to count. Before they just looked at Hispanic, African American, and white. So now they're going to use 7 different race ethnicity subgroups. They won't count alone, but they're going to be included in the analysis. The minimum group size has dropped from 30 to 25 to count in the system. And they have some new indicators that they're looking at. They're going to look at student growth, they're going to look at closing gaps, they're going to look at the various graduation plans and how successful students are on the graduation plans. And there's going to be more emphasis on advanced performance. Okay, under the old system, we basically looked, did they pass or not? Under the new system, we're going to look at performance all the way, and most of it on that highest blue bar that we saw from that graph earlier. And so here's how they might make a calculation. Is they might look at each student group and they'll look at the percent of students that pass the test. That's level 2 is passing. So here you see Native American, there's a little bar there indicating that group's too small to count. Okay, same thing with Pacific Islander, but you can see the 7 race ethnicity subgroups there, plus LEP students, plus special ed. Economically disadvantaged are included in some of them. This is just a sample calculation. None of them are actually calculated this way. But here's how they figure it out. They take all those percentages for those subgroups and add them all up, and then they would divide it by the number of groups, and that would give the index score for that particular index. So it's fairly typical of the way that these calculations are done. There's a lot more complexity to it, but nonetheless, they take percentages of groups and then add those percentages together, find an average percentage, and that's what the index score is based on. Okay? So here's what the 4 indices look like. The first one, student achievement, is basically looking at all students on all tests that are taken in the course of the year across all the grade levels. So they take all the test results, dump it into one big barrel, and figure out what percent of the kids pass all the tests that were taken. The second one has to do with student progress. I mentioned that this one looks at student performance from one year to the next. So they're going to classify students based upon the amount of growth that they made. Obviously, they need 2 years of data on a student to do that. So this year, they'll use the 2012 data plus the 2013 data and look at student by student how much they improved. Closing performance gaps. This one's kind of interesting. What they're going to do is look at 3 groups. They'll look at economically disadvantaged students, basically the students on free and reduced lunch, and the 2 lowest performing race ethnicity subgroups from the prior year. So if African American and Asian were your 2 lowest performing groups from the prior year, they would be looking at the performance of those students in this year and using that to figure out performance on index 3. And then finally, post-secondary readiness. This one is going to impact high schools highly. It's got to do with high school completion rate and the graduation program that students are under, and also looking at STAR performance at the level 2 final level, which tells us how well students are prepared for the next level. So here's how they're going to figure out how we get our ratings. They've set targets for 2013. So here's the actual targets. For Index 1, they've set a target at 50. So let's say our district or one of our high schools gets an 80 on Index 1, they would have met that particular target. Index 2, instead of setting up an absolute score, they're going to set it at the 5th percentile. So they're going to take all of the campuses in the state or all the districts in the state, find where the 5th percentile is, and then put the cut score there. We don't know exactly where that is until we get all the results back, obviously. And then Index 3 for the closing performance gaps, it's going to be set at 55. And Index 4, the post-secondary readiness, is is going to be set at 75. All right, so in this scenario, you can see this particular campus or district met all of those targets, so that would be a good thing in terms of their accountability rate. And in fact, the system is set up so that if you meet all of the targets, then that's a good thing. If you miss one of the targets, that's a bad thing. Okay, so that's going to determine your rating in 2013. So this year in August, when the ratings come out, there's going to be 2 ratings that each campus and district will get. They'll either be met standard or improvement needed. So basically, if you met all the targets, you're going to be met standard. If you fell behind on 1 or more, then you'll get the rating of improvement needed. Okay, high schools and districts will be rated on 4 because of the way the law is written. Elementary and middle schools will be rated on 3 this first year. However, they'll add the post-secondary readiness one in 2014 for them. There's also some additional, what they're calling distinction designations for other types of performance, kind of gravy on top of your ratings. And then the commissioner a couple of weeks ago came out with his final decisions about the accountability system. And for the first time in black and white, we saw the discussion of having an ABCDF system for accountability in 2014. So while we are fairly well assured of what 2013 looks like, it's still kind of up in the air what it's going to look like in 2014 and beyond. So it may be at the point where campuses and districts get ratings that are ABCDF, kind of like they do in Florida and some other states. Okay, so my concern with the new accountability system is that it's rather convoluted in how these calculations are made. The other system, like I said, you can pretty much explain it to people. This one is going to take data from assessment, graduation, and other types of data, put it into this black box, sort of shake it up, and then figure out these 4 indices based on that, and then come out with the rating. My concern is that from my position, it's going to be very difficult to explain to people where the numbers came from. So in each one of these 4 areas, a campus and the district will get a number that's going to show up in the newspaper. Okay, so I can already see the table in the Star Telegram that shows the campuses or the district. Okay, and it's going to show index 1, what score you got, index 2, index 3, index 4. But those numbers are meaningless unless you know them in context. Unless you know how they were derived and what they're based on, they don't really mean a whole lot. Okay? That's the concern that I have about this new accountability system, is that it's going to look like a black box. Now, I'm not going to go over all of this, but just to give you an idea of the complexity, here's an example of part of the calculation for index 2, and I apologize, I don't think you got this slide. But notice that all of that would go into the calculation to figure out index 2. And in fact, the top part is just for reading. The bottom part shows reading, math, and writing. So that basically those calculations that are done at the top would be repeated for 2 other subjects, and then all of that would go into the bottom calculation. But then down there at the bottom in the lower right, you see that 64. That's the only thing that's going to show up, is the 64. So all those other numbers went into the calculation, but the 64 is what's going to show up in the newspaper. So again, there's this non-transparency to this new accountability system that I think is going to be problematic. And because we know that those accountability ratings end up on the signs that realtors put in the front yard, that is a concern to me, that it may not be well understood how those accountability ratings actually reflect what's going on. I think it's a better system, it's just a lot less transparent. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up, why don't I ask questions that you guys may have? I know we're kind of getting short on time. Do you have questions or comments? Or? Yes, sir.
Is the concern of the district more of the actual rating system, or is it more, more pointing towards you don't know what you're going to be teaching to get these results?
No, I think the uncertainty is just maybe the context. They haven't given us, they've given the standards, so you kind of know where the target is, but it's not sure where the bullseye is. You have to evaluate a little bit the context of that. So I think in a year or 2, once they give us more examples of questions, we'll be able to narrow the focus. But we have an idea of the standards. What we do know is that clearly, if you just study a past, and David, I think did a great job of pointing out where we were, and then kind of we transitioned over the last 10 to 15 years. If we analyze it, you clearly see, as David pointed out, we know we've got to make some adjustments in the rigor, and just think about all the things that happened in district, our district is different than it was 20 years ago. And you have to meet the needs of your customers. Just like a basketball coach, coaches differently when you've got 6'6", 6'8" guys, you've got 5'9", 5'7" guys. If your customers are different, you have to change your strategy. Doesn't mean you can't be successful. You just have to make those adjustments to the needs of the kids. So we have to do two things. We have to adjust the needs of the kids, and we have to prepare our educators so that they can be successful. But what's indicated here is just clearly the rigor is there. We just have to, through professional development and through designing the system of success for our kids, that it all works in conjunction so that we're seeing the results we need to see. So given time, we'll adjust for this. I think you've already seen that. You've seen the 50 days to back up more where we should be, because we should be. I'll say it. We should be outperforming the state. We're going to need to do better than that. But it's a process. As David said, you don't turn the ship just like that. So we want to do better, i.e. we will. You've got to find out where your kids are. You've got to find out about assessment. You've got to do professional development. You've got to monitor that. You've got to make adjustments where it didn't work. But we're going to figure this out.
If I can add something, one of the greatest challenges is the K2 system, K3 primary. And that's true, not just in Berkeley, but everywhere. What we know about STAR is that it is, like David said, vertically aligned, but it's also it really emphasizes literacy. And even when you look at these assessments, the emphasis is on the ability to read, comprehend, and use critical thinking and problem solving. That's true for science and social studies and math. So the emphasis more than ever is not just like, for instance, in math. It's not just on the algorithm of solving a mathematical problem. It's about reading and determining what the examples that they give you. They're not necessarily asking for the answer. They're asking for to pick the equation that would represent the best approach. So reading and literacy is a strong emphasis. The third grade reading test is over 50% influential. And 22 of the questions, 22, you have to answer them. Now that, I think if I have, my largest concern is Berkeley. It is significantly more difficult. Significant.
We're asking third graders to not just go back to the text and find the answer. They're having to go back, read, understand, and make an inference. It says, oh, because of that, then this would be the case, third grade. That's something different than what even a successful third grade teacher is reading to. So that's going to be the greatest challenge. It's a 20-year veteran, third grade teacher who's having success on tax. You've got to say, the game has changed. It would be like in basketball, if it's now free throws are 3 points, and the 3-point shot you have 1, you only get a half if you score within 10 feet of the basket. You'd have to go, whoa, we got to totally change the strategy. Because the way the system's changed. That's how I see it. Other questions?
Is that a direct focus on that third grade might be a critical point in the
Third grade is a very critical point, but it has great implications for what we do with kindergarten children and first and second grade children. And more than ever, K2 has got to be explicit instruction, extremely intentional, and very much aligned to what, remember that well-prepared, second graders must be well prepared for the third grade. So that means K1 has got to be also in alignment with what goes. So it's all, you have to almost look at what does well-prepared mean for third grade and back it down and make sure that our kindergarten, first and second grade teachers are teaching those standards and that kids are mastering. And that's a change. That is a huge change.
And just understand there's not things in place. The state doesn't give you something that says, here's a grade 7 in kindergarten where your kids should be if your kids are mastering the standards in kindergarten. Those things are not there, not in any form of that. So we have to develop things that put the target out there for our kindergarten help set it and say, here's your jobs in kindergarten, they need to be about here. And in first grade, they've got to be here, second grade, they've got to be here. It's not just I taught it, you've got to have some evidence that says the kids learned it. And if not, then what do you do in first grade to go back and catch those real quickly and then build on the first grade, so that that third grade teacher has a quality there that's within reason of maximum standards. Can you imagine if K1 and 2 misses it? Well intentioned, but just miss it. And that third grade teacher goes, oh my goodness. It's like a fourth grade teacher getting a kid that can't write at all. And they're supposed to be able to write a level 3 or 4 paper by the end of fourth grade, and they can't write at all. You can't do that. You've got to teach them about writing K1 and 2, so that third grade starts really building on that, and that fourth grade then is putting guys on the page. If you don't have that system in place, it's going to be hit and miss, for sure. Good question. Other things that we can answer for you today?
Not really a question, but I only have a first grader, so, and I haven't really entered this yet. I just hear scary stories. A lot of times everyone hates task tests, it's an anxiety, it's a very stressful thing on everyone, teachers, the kids. Kids are only learning about tests, not necessarily the things they should be learning. Everything is just about these tests. I don't know, like, what good can you say about it? It sounds scary.
I can't tell you if there's not anxiety. I mean, think about what you just heard, okay? And your response with it. You know these levels. You be anxious.
Oh, yeah.
So, can I talk to people about human nature that loves kids and they want their kids to do well, to not be anxious? That part, we talk to them all the time about being focused and being ready to celebrate at the end of the year, knowing you've done all that you know to do. You can't guarantee results, but you can prepare. It's like when you know you've done a great job studying film, you've done the best approach you can, and your kids go out and give a great effort, you go, great job. We did what we knew to do, we did it, played hard, we did exactly what we asked you to do, we didn't win, but we won, because we did all we could. That's the approach you've got to take. You can't guarantee results. You can't be aligned, you can't be prepared, you can't work hard, and your kids can go do those are the things we do. So I can't talk about that other than we tell people, don't let people see your anxiety. Don't pressure kids like that. Just prepare them and tell them they're going to do great. And so we probably do that better in places than that. But to say to you that, all we worry about the test, did you see the third grade item? Is there a way to trick the system to get kids to be successful on that? Folks, this is not test taking anymore. It's not like, oh, every time you see a square, add up the 4 numbers, put the answer, that's it. Those days are gone. That was back in the team, long, long years ago, back in the team. TOTS took care of that. TACS went away from it. STAR, there is no rigorous learning about the test. The test is more global. The test is at a very rigorous level. Read the questions. What I'd say to a teacher, if you can get my kid to be successful on that, good for you. I don't care what you do. Because you have to be able to read, understand things, apply. So this is not about playing a game. I've got to teach my kids to read, understand, and make an inference in third grade. I don't care how you get them to do that. That's a learning skill. That's the rigor it's at. So when somebody says, oh, they're just preparing for tests. Yes, they are. Very rigorous tests. And it's at a very, very high level. So you have to teach, the kids have to understand to be successful on STAR, period.
Well, it's also the way to approach it. You cannot separate teaching from assessment. They go together. And what we have is we're transitioning from a system that where teaching was not necessarily connected to assessment. We taught, and then, oh, by the way, we had to take this assessment. What we're moving to now is more of an integrated approach where instruction and assessment go hand in hand. So if I'm going to teach reading, and I know that in the third grade I've got 22 inferential questions, and by the way, they're not based upon the personal schema, which is the way it used to be. It's now based upon text-based evidence. So I would say in a small group, we're going to read and then we'll ask questions and I'm going to say, find in your reading, why do you think the author what is the author's intention about so-and-so? Look for the evidence in what you just read. Now that is an assessment. I'm assessing as I teach. So then if we become more and more automatic in that kind of approach to teaching, then when kids sit down to take an assessment, then it's what we used to call, we've removed the element of surprise. The worst thing we can do for a kid is not teach the way we're going to be assessing, because then kids sit down to do a test and they're totally unprepared. I can remember going into a test and looking at it and thought, oh my gosh, I don't remember having any of this. Now that stresses me out. But if I go into an assessment and sit down and I say, this is just like what we do in class, then I'm not going to be stressed about an assessment. So the teacher then should say, I'm going to prepare you. I'm going to teach you the standards, and we're going to learn in such a way that you are not going to be surprised when you have to take that test.
And you tell them, you don't have to get them all. Just tell them you're prepared. You do well enough in class, you show up and test at it, you do your best, go through the things we've taught you, the different levels and processes and the steps of things. This is what we do. Choose what you think the best answer is, and you're probably going to be fine.
So every day should represent what the standards are and the way the standards and what kids have to do and know to be successful. If every day, the homework, the classwork, what we do, if it all is representative of what David just showed you, the content, the context, and the cognitive, if we do that, then kids are going to be well prepared. But if we're missing, if we say, well, we teach the standard, but by the way, my activities are what I always used to do, or I'm giving homework that's just not representative of what kids really need to do, then our kids are not going to be prepared. So that's the big, huge change for teachers.
And the best way you can try to avoid that is don't allow teachers to work in isolation. That's why we have professional learning communities, that's why we collaborate, so that somebody can't be well-intentioned doing what they think is right and be missing the mark the whole time. You're less likely to do that if a group of 7 of you plan together, because one teacher's going to say, well, time out, I think that standard is this, so we're not allowing teaching in isolation. We're planning in isolation, we look at each other's assessments, that's the only way to do it.
And our curriculum documents, every single standard in Educor has a what we call a standard or clarification document where it says what the content is, what the context is, and what the cognitive rigor is, and we give them an example of how this could be tested. So if they will look at those standard clarification documents and set it within a PLC, and let's talk about how we need to teach this, what kind of work we need to give kids, what resources would be great, then I think our kids are going to be prepared, and it eliminates that stress. I'm not stressed if I know what to expect. I can get stressed if it's a surprise.
You said if they will send in a PLC, what if, is it required that
It's
they
required.
do? Okay, so
That's
there's
what
no
we're
ifs,
trying to
ands, or
do.
buts, so essentially,
And some function better than others.
Yes,
well,
but
it's not
essentially
it's
not
a trickle down. We should be okay, because if they're teaching the way, what they're supposed to and the way they're supposed to, the kids, you're gonna have some kids that just learn differently, but we're modifying it.
But just to be open with you, obviously, kids in the system where they are, where they've been, in K through 4, they didn't experience that.
Right.
They're sitting in 6th grade now. It's hard to make up that K
Right.
through 4 gap. We try with intervention, but through time, kindergarten's doing well this year, and then they go to 1st grade next year. By the time those kids get to 5th and 6th grade, they should not be at the same place that our gap kids are
Right.
now. Because if kids are allowed to go through the system behind, you realize you get a 5th grader and they're reading the 2nd grade level, you just go, wow. I'm supposed to be teaching these skills, they need to be at least here, they're way down here. If you have several of those kids, that can pose a stress in the system. So There's not that natural place to PLC in elementary. We're trying to create those opportunities. We've created some by giving some extra time for teachers to do that in the secondary campus. Yes, ma'am.
So going off of that, like, what about the kids who are already at the highest bar? Like, what is the teaching, I see that the target level at like the other ones, what are kind of the, what I mean, like, what is the, and especially if since I know that over time, like, more and more are caught up, so then the bars are gonna be raised, so kind of what is the teaching level when you have the kids are kind of at that?
The advanced thing is something that's going to be difficult to get to. Our kids who are even the brightest kids, they're going to struggle to get to the advanced level. This rigorous of the test, it's not that we're going to have a large number of kids that just come in, okay, wow, I think I've understood the questions right. That's not going to be the case. The hardest part is what you described. Caroline Thompson probably does it the best when you talk about how to raise the bar for kids, how to individualize instruction in a large classroom setting. It's easy to say, it's very difficult to do. I'd say it's the thing that teachers struggle with the most. How do you differentiate instruction in a classroom? You've got kids that it varies from standard to standard. If you go to a new standard, your child may be one of those excelling in that. As you go to the next standard, your child may go, they're not excelling in that. They're kind of in the middle of the pack. So it's not like you go, well, Crystal and Sonny just do right and everything. Well, to an extent, yes. But in some of these mathematical standards, some of these science concepts, it's yes and no, yes and no. I get these kind more abstract, or this more mathematical, the struggle with. That's hard to do. You need planning time for that. To say that, what am I going to do with these three that already get it? How am I going to use technology to maybe let them extend their knowledge, but the other 19 are behind? Well, this time it's 7, and it's 14 or whatever. That's asking a lot of teachers to do that. We are working on those kind of things about how do you differentiate instruction in the classroom. Elementary started to do it better with Learning Center. The center changes, the groups change. Today it's you 3 because you 3 have got it. Y'all get to do this at this table. When the next group comes to the table, you do activity B, which is not what you did. So that's how you do that. You differentiate instruction. You 3 did something different. The next 4 that came to the table, they're the group that really needs intervention. So they didn't get to do what you did, they do something different.
But I just see it as like a goal, like if it's, like I understand it takes, like that's what my background is in teaching. And I understand it takes a while to get to that. So it seems like as a future focus or wonder, I mean, something that would need to be addressed is as more kids every year coming in at a higher percentage, then kind of the change. Does that make sense? Does it understand what I'm saying? Kind of the change of teaching is to kind of still challenge the ones that
We need to
are.
always challenge.
Yeah, to be challenged at even the higher.
And even the kids who aren't, we need to look at data, even those who are gifted and talented are in pre-AP, AP classes, and make certain that on all of these standards that they are scoring, that's where you begin to really disaggregate all the data and see exactly where they are on each of the standards, and that's why we use what we call curriculum-based assessments locally to look, and we're asking teachers to develop common assessments based upon what they're teaching and to make sure that kids are truly demonstrating mastery, because you can pass the test even at a commended level and still miss some things that you really need to have mastery of as you go into more advanced coursework.
Well,